We're really excited to have you here tonight at our first workshop of 2025. This is Introduction to Cooperatives, and we're going to talk about cooperative principles and cooperative practices tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. Next slide. This is the first in our multifaceted 2025 programming. So this is part of our Cooperative Foundations workshop series. We'll also be offering a workshop on co-op conversions and how to start new cooperatives. So look forward to those during the rest of the year. We'll have co-op skill shares. This will be a chance for co-ops that already exist in the community to share key skills or insights that they think are really important to share with the community. So it's going to be really a community building kind of co-learning experience. And then finally, we've got our co-op talks. And think of this as kind of office hours. We've talked in the past a little bit about conflict resolution in co-ops, governance and decision-making. And so this is a chance to kind of get your questions answered in a small group setting. And so if you're interested in any of these other co-op offerings, the calendar is up on our website. That's stl.coop. Let's throw that in the chat. And you can see exactly when we're going to have the rest of these workshops this year. Next slide. Tonight, this is going to be facilitated by 3 members of the Co-op STL team. That is myself. My name is Zandi Barrett. I use she, they pronouns. I'll pass it over to Chris.
My name is Chris Wilcox. I use he, him pronouns.
And Jenny.
My name is Jenny, and I use she, her pronouns.
And then we would also, next slide, like to hear a little bit about who you are and what brings you here tonight. So if you wouldn't mind taking the next couple minutes to share in the chat your name, your group affiliation, if any, your pronouns, and if there's a good TV show or movie that you've seen recently that you want to share with the rest of the group here tonight. And you can go ahead and type that in the chat as you're ready. All right, so we have Ellen, who uses any pronouns. They are a part of a group of wellness practitioners hoping to form a cooperative business and are rereading Fourth Wing. We've got Heather Cameron from WashU, who's been doing work on co-ops and community wealth building and has enjoyed watching The Agency. John, he, him, who works with Studio Land Arts, who's also here tonight. Chris from Studio Land Arts. We've got Sonia, who lives in Maryland, who's currently in grad school, no TV, does not currently have a group affiliation, but is just generally interested in community economics. Well, welcome, folks. We also have Katie Carpenter. Katie runs Perennial, which is a nonprofit and is just interested in learning about co-ops. No good TV shows recently. All right, thanks so much, y'all, for joining us tonight. We will continue to share in the chat. Feel free, as you have thoughts and questions, you can raise your hand, you can share them in the chat. This is really, we want this to be an open conversation as we're communicating tonight. Next slide.
We'll have dedicated discussions parts, but if you have any questions or comments you want to make, we can read them out as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so tonight, what will we definitely do? We're definitely going to introduce the concept of co-ops, talk about the historical context that co-ops developed within. We're going to talk about different types of co-ops and the traditional cooperative principles. And we're going to present some considerations for cooperative management. What we might do, we might talk through some examples and elaborate on concepts based on the questions you bring up tonight. And what we definitely won't do, we're not going to go in depth on co-op management decision making. That's kind of a different workshop. And we will also not give you specific advice for your organization. If you are interested more in the kind of governance management or decision making, we do have recordings that go a bit more in depth on those on our website. Next slide. So community agreements for tonight. We want to make sure that we're bringing this into our space. So the first one is no one knows everything, but together we know a lot. You know, even as myself, Chris, and Jenny are talking about our expertise with co-ops, we know that we also don't know everything, and that y'all also have expertise to share. And so if you have an idea, we also want you to bring that into the space. We want folks to be curious and open. Speak from your own experience. Take space, make space / why am I talking? Why am I not talking? So if you feel like you're talking a lot tonight, then maybe think about taking a step back. Or if you feel like maybe you could share more, take that opportunity to share tonight. We also understand we can't articulate all of the time. So definitely give folks the benefit of the doubt and really ask questions to gain clarity and understand what folks are trying to communicate with you. And finally, confidentiality. So, we want folks to take a lot of learning out of tonight, but also don't share specifics about what you learned tonight if you shouldn't be sharing it. So take your learnings away, but maybe not the specifics away with you. Are there any other learning agreements folks would like to add to the list? You can either pop that in the chat or, raise your hand or come off mute and share that. Right. Yeah, and again, we really encourage you to, interrupt us if you need to or share things in the chat tonight. This should be a really open conversation. Next slide. All right. So now that we've got some of that housekeeping out of the way, why are we here? We're here to learn about what is a co-op and how can we grow that in St. Louis. So a cooperative is a self-governing group of people who voluntarily work together to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. This is a definition that we as Co-op St. Louis came up with. So you might see some other definitions out there, but we really want to think of cooperatives as any entity where folks are working together through joint ownership. So it's a member-owned thing, it's member-controlled, it's member benefiting. And this could we'll talk about the different structures. It can look a lot of different ways, but as long as it's holding kind of these core values together, that's what a cooperative is when we talk about it. And I will pass it over to Jenny now to share some definitions.
All right, yeah, we just wanted to kind of put up front some words that we're going to be using probably over and over again as we talk tonight about the sort of basics of co-ops. So some important vocab that we'll introduce here, and hopefully if you're hearing them for the first time, you'll have a really great understanding by the end of our hour and a half together. But member, so is an individual that contributes to and shares ownership of a cooperative. So a member is sort of the general term that's used often for the folks who make up the co-op, but will also sometimes be interchanged with things like worker owner, member owner. But a member is that person who's contributing to the co-op and benefiting from the co-op. In terms of benefit, when we say benefit, we're talking about the outcome a cooperative is designed to produce for its members. This could vary depending on the type of co-op. So it could be a benefit of like a monetary payout because like maybe operates as a business, it's doing well. It could be the benefit of discounts on food because you're a member of a consumer co-op. But the benefit is just that thing that we would all kind of get out of being in a co-op together. And then governance, we're going to talk a little bit about this later in the workshop, but it's the system under which members make decisions for the cooperative. So it's the structure that's in place to help a co-op make decisions because it's not just one person making a decision, it's a group of people. So you can set that up in a lot of different ways. So member, benefit, and governance we'll continue to hear throughout the evening. The other thing that we like to kick off all our workshops with is just a little overview of the cooperative principles and values. tonight, because this is the introduction to co-ops, I'm just going to touch on each of these, but oftentimes we'll sort of pull out ones that seem most important to the topic at hand. But these principles and values, this is the Rochdale cooperative principles. So they were written in like the mid 1800s by a group of dudes who were like getting into collective ownership. And they've continued to be used over time as a way to kind of help direct and guide the movement of co-ops more broadly and largely. So if you're interested in starting a co-op and getting involved in one, sort of understanding these can help your co-op have a bigger impact and kind of make sure that what you're doing is aligned with the larger movement. So voluntary and open membership, it just means that membership should be open to anyone. There might be things that you have to do to become a member, but it's never restricted by like gender, race, those things. Education, training, and information. Co-ops should be really invested in training and educating their members, whether that's about kind of the operations of the business so that they can make good decisions, or how co-ops work. It's a really key component to a successful co-op. Autonomy and independence, co-ops should be autonomous, so they are able to operate outside of the, whims of shareholders or things like that. Something that they don't have control over is not controlling them. They get to be independent. They get to make their own decisions. Democratic member control, the members, which we talked about earlier, control everything. So they're making the decisions and they're doing that through some sort of democratic system. Concern for community, this is a good one that kind of puts us outside of maybe the day-to-day of our co-op, but this is a principle in which co-ops should be, thinking about their broader community and making sure that sort of the decisions that they're making inside of the co-op are also going to be beneficial for all. Economic member participation, this means that our members are paying into the co-op potentially, but they're also getting maybe benefit economic out of it, and that they're all participating in that. So they're educated, they're able to make those decisions and be able to kind of understand the money moving in and out. Cooperation among cooperatives. This is another one that kind of pulls us outside maybe the little silo of our individual co-ops, but the co-op movement at large is really big on supporting each other. So to help our movement be more powerful, making sure that we're assisting each other and also helping to build networks and ecosystems where co-ops can work together and really create a really robust way to support all of that work and the people who are involved in it. So all those principles and values, we sort of keep in mind as we're operating our co-ops. And just a quick kind of question for the chat, if you guys want to drop something in there or come off mute and answer. But, thinking about those principles, are there groups or organizations that, are part of your life right now that might benefit from one or some of those principles? Did anything really resonate with you? And it might not be, it could be your workplace, it could be like a government entity, it could be a small group of friends. But yeah, did any of the principles really stand out to you? And I'll go back one
my name
slide
is
so you can see those again too.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi. So I'm sorry. I'm in grad school, as I mentioned in the chat, and I'm studying how a group of people from the Afro-Caribbean diaspora and West Africans save informally together and why they choose to do so, even though they have access to formal savings instruments. So it operates a lot on the principles of cooperatives.
Nice.
Savings mechanism.
Yeah, definitely seeing that play out there. Any of these resonate with anybody else? They'll continue to come up. So if you don't have anything right now, feel free to drop it in the chat later. Or come off mute, let us know. We're gonna get on to our next section here. And Chris is gonna talk about the kind of more history of co-ops. So I'll let him take it from here.
Yes, so we're going to have a brief overview of where cooperative principles have been practiced historically, where we go back to it. So obviously it has a very long history, so I won't be able to go into all the details, but you can find a little bit more of our full timeline in our cooperative guide, which is on our website. And we have print copies as well. Next slide. So here's our abbreviated timeline. So the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers, where we took the principles that Jenny just discussed. So this is kind of seen as some of the original idea. Obviously, it's not the first time cooperative principles have been used. Many indigenous practices follow similar principles, such as collective ownership of land. But this is kind of where, in recorded history in Europe and North America, where we take some of these ideas. And so all of these principles that Jenny had just mentioned are still principles used by the International Association of Worker Co-ops. And so this is where some of that was first being experimented with folks from England. But other examples throughout history of cooperatives, the Underground Railroad, mutual aid societies, and communes, particularly after the end of the Civil War, and where formerly enslaved people who didn't get support that they deserve from the regular government and communities, so they often form their own associations to share resources and provide collective services by pooling those resources together. Going further into U.S. history in the 1930s and 40s, you had examples like the United States Young Negroes Cooperative League. It was led by this one in particular was led by activist Ella Baker for the specific purpose of gaining economic empower through cooperation. This is another common theme throughout cooperatives, is that they are a good method for folks who are generally left out of the economy as is. And so it allows people to build their own wealth from their own cooperation between each other. A lot of current day examples of people who start cooperatives are from communities that are usually left out from credit or from employment of any kind, especially returning citizens who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. There are a lot of cooperatives, people together, forming those together in order to deal with the unjust way in which the economy is currently organized. This is also the principle behind Mondragon in Spain. Mondragon today is still the largest cooperative corporation in the world. It was the story is that it was started by a priest in the Basque region of Spain, seeing the poverty that existed there, and decided, well, the only way that this is going to be developed is if we do it ourselves. It is, and of course it has grown since then. It is a large corporation, holds many cooperatives within them. And this is the model that is most often emulated and applied to other cooperatives. More in the current day, Evergreen Cooperatives is explicitly based on this model. So this is in Cleveland. It started with a laundry business that started doing business with the Cleveland Clinic, being able to have that anchor institution be a reliable customer allowed that to succeed and grow. Eventually, it started using the earnings and profits from this to start other cooperatives in the Cleveland area. And also to acquire existing businesses and to convert to cooperatives. This is often like the easiest gains to make is, instead of having to create a whole new business and taking on those additional risks, you have businesses that already exist that are doing all right, or just facilitate a sale and handover of control and operations to the workers. One example in Cleveland was during the start of the pandemic. They actually purchased a cafe at its pre-pandemic price. It's another thing about cooperatives is they actually tend to be pretty resilient in the face of economic downturns. And this was the case in the financial crisis in the Basque region of Spain, where Mondragon is. It was hurt a little bit less than the rest of Spain comparatively because of the cooperative ecosystem that was set in. Also, income inequality is much lower in those areas where cooperatives are flourishing. And other more contemporary projects, the Boston Ojima project, Cooperation Jackson, especially they've been, may have heard that, in Jackson, that, the water has been compromised. And so they are the folks on the ground who are organizing about that, making sure to administer mutual aid and building the kind of cooperative collective economy. Next slide. So why cooperatives? So all the principles that Jenny mentioned are what is supposed to have cooperatives stand out as a particularly positive influence relative to similar organizations. So some of the benefits are that it practices equitable relationships. Ideally, in a worker cooperative, for instance, you're not dealing with a difference in power between the owner and the workers. In some way, the workers own the business. The exact nature of that ownership may change from cooperative to cooperative, but ideally, based on the cooperative principles, it works on one worker, one vote. That's considered the gold standard, the National Association of Cooperatives. And so these are a way to practice relations in the economy that you don't normally get to do, where they're primarily top down, and usually the profits go to the owner instead of the employees who created the value. And so that value is captured within by the workers themselves. They're rooted in the local community. It's much more difficult to, say, extract wealth out of a community through a cooperative when the people who are members of it live in the community. People in general don't have an interest in moving their own jobs someplace else. They're motivated to keep their business running and to keep business in the community so that the profits and sales and all of the revenue stays in the community. It doesn't get extracted to shareholders in a publicly traded company or a firm or a family someplace that lives far outside of it. Generally speaking, the people who participate in cooperatives are doing so within their own community, and they're sharing resources that stay in that community. It disrupts repressive systems, which is one of those, which is related to what I just mentioned about wealth being extracted from communities, especially through, say, gentrification or lavish tax credits to bring industries and jobs into the area. It's a way to find a different path in making sure that wealth is much more equitably distributed throughout the community. They tend to have long-term resilience. Cooperative members have a good reason to want to continue the cooperative. Often a lot of other businesses, one of the disadvantages is that a lot of startups, for instance, are mostly made for a short-term liquidity event. The actual long-term longevity of the company may be secondary, where especially if they take a lot of venture capital funding, their interest is to turn it over to maybe get bought by a bigger corporation to have a public stock offering or some kind of liquidity event. Whereas in the cooperatives, the interest is to keep it benefiting the members in the long term. And so this is one of the benefits of cooperatives over similar organizations as its peers. And it shares the benefits between the members, depending on what kind of cooperative it is. Next slide. So these are an example of different types of cooperatives. The one we tend to talk about most of them, maybe the most well-known, are worker cooperatives. These are cooperatives in which the business that provides a good or service is owned collectively by its workers. And so, and ideally they work under the principle of one worker, one vote. Yeah. I'm going to pass it over to Zondi to get into the rest of them.
Yeah, so beyond worker cooperatives, you can have worker self-directed nonprofits, which function in some ways similar to a worker cooperative. The idea of a worker self-directed nonprofit is that the decision-making that you see in a worker cooperative is very similar in a worker self-directed nonprofit. Obviously, what you're missing is that kind of financial ownership stake because nonprofits are not owned by anyone. But the idea is that you still have the mission-driven benefit of a traditional kind of 501(c)(3) entity with the worker control that you might see in a worker co-op. Other types of co-ops, you can have purchasing or retail co-ops. These can look like a couple different things. Maybe you have a group of artisans or bakers or farmers who know that maybe by themselves they're not going to get a good deal on a big order of equipment that they need. What they can do instead is join together as a co-op and make these purchases together, and then they get the benefit of the better deals working as a co-op in that way. You can also see retail co-ops or consumer co-ops, kind of like a grocery store. You see these a lot, where it is the people who actually go and buy the different products who are members. And in that case, maybe they are buying things more at the bulk price, or again, you're getting that benefit on cost by paying the membership that kind of takes care of the administrative parts of running that cooperative. Producer co-ops are kind of the other side of this coin, where instead of getting the benefits of purchasing, as a producer co-op, it's where a bunch of different maybe artisans or farmers join together to sell their product. And so they get the benefit of kind of all of the admin again when they're selling their product on to the final customer, where then maybe they share marketing, maybe they share final logistics together. And that again makes it cheaper for them to then sell the product on. Credit unions, you might be a member of a credit union, but these are alternatives to banks, where members of the credit unions get benefits from banking at these institutions. And they're a bit more equitable than a traditional bank, where there might be someone who is trying to kind of skim some money off the top when you're banking with them. You can also see housing co-ops, and this is where anyone who lives in that building, apartment building, maybe multifamily home, maybe it's a bunch of different single-family homes, they own that property together. And you can have different kinds of housing co-ops. Some of them, maybe you put equity in at the start, and it's more of a traditional mortgage, but you're sharing the property. There are also some newer models called limited equity cooperatives, which really take some of the initial input and then additional equity that you traditionally have to put down for housing. It reduces that burden. So housing cooperatives are another kind of cooperative. And last but not least is a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which can really look like a bunch of these different components put together. So you could have a worker self-directed nonprofit, but that also has a member class that are producers, or it could have a member class that are consumers. And it is accounting for all these different groups of people who are coming together to share that decision-making and ownership in a way that works for the cooperative. So it's kind of the mix and match version of cooperatives. Next slide. We want to talk a little bit about a couple different St. Louis-based examples of cooperatives that are doing really cool and interesting work here. The first one that we want to mention is Switchgrass Spirits. They are a worker cooperative, and they have 3 different membership classes. So again, thinking back to those definitions, a member is someone who owns a cooperative, and that's really how we want to think about different types of cooperatives. They have the founder class, and these are the folks, I think it was originally 3, who came together and said, we want to start this distillery company in St. Louis. We're going to come together, we're going to put down the capital, a lot of the initial investment, and put down our expertise and really form this company. There's also the investor class, and these are folks, obviously the founders didn't have all of the capital that they needed to launch this distillery, so they had some friends and family and other investors come in as an additional class. And then the sustainers. And so what's interesting about their model is that they knew as founders, they were putting a lot of labor and time and intensity into building this structure, but they eventually wanted to transition the company into the people who are going to carry it forward, which is themselves, but also new workers that they bring on board. And so that's the sustainer class, who are current employees who are going to be future owners. So what it looks like right now is the founders and investors have put in this initial capital, and so they're technically right now the owners of this company, but they've recently started to bring on their sustainer class as new employees to the company. And in the next 5 to 6 years, the sustainer class is going to slowly buy out the founders and investors and eventually have full ownership of the company. And then some of the founders themselves are going to become part of the sustainer class moving forward. And so it'll truly become a more level playing field of a company, but also honor the time and investment that the founders put into building it. Currently, the founders make decisions with a supermajority amongst themselves. but sustainers have the ability to vote on any changes to the operating agreement and the eventual buyout of the company. And benefiting, so at the buyout, again, like I said, the funders put in a lot of time and energy, so they will be compensated for the starting capital that they put into the company. And sustainers after buyout will take the ownership and any profits after that point. Next slide. When we look at housing cooperatives, a housing cooperative in St. Louis is the Hidden Alley Ranch Cooperative. In this cooperative, residents can become members after a 6-month trial period. So you will live in the housing for 6 months, still making decisions, but not having that equity and that financial ownership stake, and then eventually be able to get that after 6 months. When we're thinking about ownership, it looks like part of the monthly payments are going to building equity. So like in a traditional home ownership structure, part of the money you put every month to your mortgage goes into building down that equity. That is what it would look like in this cooperative, but it's a smaller amount because it is part of a larger whole. And this is proportional to income. As far as control, it works as a consensus basis among all the members, and members in the trial period also have a say in most decisions, including thinking about maintenance, thinking about how does this community of folks who are living together really work and function together. And lastly, benefiting. The benefit is affordable housing and the kind of amenities and community that you get by choosing to live in community with other people. Next slide. All right, and I will pass it back to Chris.
Thanks. Yeah, so I wanted to take some time and open the floor to discussion as we start to think about some of the material we've covered so far. So I wanted to ask the group what interests you most about cooperatives so far, especially if it's been sparked by anything you've just heard in the first part of the presentation. What is most exciting to you about cooperatives, and have you engaged with them before? What are your experiences that you've had, and any context that you want to put together? I have Heather saying yes there, and also cool examples for housing in Chicago. Check out Pilsen Housing Co-op. There's a lot of new co-op activity happening in Chicago, as far as I've been told. I know the city's been putting a lot of investment into it too. Anything else from folks about things specific or question that's come up for so far from the presentation?
I think it's just cool to see how many different types there are. And I think your examples are really helpful to I think sometimes co-op can sound really, really new and unknown to people. But when you're like, oh, a credit union is something that operates with this model, it's useful to see yeah, I have engaged with them before, even without maybe realizing it or categorizing it in that way. So yeah, just cool to see so much variety, but having those shared values is really neat. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And the values are key, because that's what to the extent that it is different from pure organizations, it's to the faithfulness that they follow those co-op principles. And yeah, there's multiple different types of cooperatives. It really depends on what specifically you're needing out of it. For instance, like consumer cooperatives are a way that you can bulk purchase things and get a cheaper rate per person than if each individual family had to go to retail and get it.
I think one of
What are
the cool
some of the
things about
smallest?
co-op
Sorry.
like language too is that a lot of times terms have are used in lots of different ways in meetings. So when you say co-op, it could mean all of those different things. And even the same with member, it has a lot of different meanings. But I've joined a credit union years and years ago, and they were like, "You're a member now," and I was like, "Okay." But now I'm like, "Oh, co-op's cool."
And Sonia, you had something.
Yeah, I was asking what are some of the smallest co-ops you've seen to perhaps I know the excuse me, the one in Spain you mentioned as being the largest, but
Yeah.
what is the range you've seen in terms of how many members it may take to form, some form of a coalition as they grow? But at those savings groups I just mentioned, we could have as few as 3 to 4 people to start. So I just wanted to get a sense of that.
Yeah, it can be any number. There's lots of very small cooperatives around the country and around the world. it depends on the industry. And I think as Jenny had mentioned earlier in the chat, like what's interesting about switchgrass is how this is the sort of business that creates a lot of that requires a lot of upfront investment. Those tend to be the most challenging because you have to get access to more capital. So the more capital intensive, so you need either more credit or more financial contribution from each of the members. But yeah, a co-op can be any number of people. It could even start with 2 people, and often they do. Or it could be like an individual. I think a pretty common thing, especially with conversions, is it could just be an individual owner that decides to take on people who were their employees as members, or they want to sell it to their employees, and maybe a small business that had just a couple of employees, and they have a very common strategy that we look to now in terms of growing cooperatives is if a business doesn't have an obvious successor, they could sell it to their workers, and that would be a matter of getting credit and working out how the operations would go to form a worker co-op model. And let's see, are cooperatives, also from Sophia, are cooperatives usually in the same state and city? Can they stretch across states? That is a good question because the community and the networks really matter. They tend to work best together, the cooperation between cooperatives that you just mentioned. So Cleveland is an example of this in practice. Another notable geographic region for cooperatives is the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. This was enabled by some legislation and investments that allowed people to pool their unemployment benefits into a lump sum on the condition that they use it to purchase and start a cooperative if their business was closing or going out of business. That would trigger unemployment benefits for layoffs. So that was one of the reasons why there are a lot of cooperatives in this particular region of Italy. And, when cooperatives are sharing resources, sharing practices, sharing, habits, and, they're in the room together and coordinating their activities, they tend to work better. I think Boston has a pretty well-known cooperative corridor as another example.
I do want to say, I think it really depends on the type of cooperative you are. One co-op that I really love is Aorta. They are a training co-op, like a workshop training cooperative. I've done some facilitation trainings with them. And because they're all online in this kind of new digital world we live in, they are able to work as a co-op that has people in different places and still build that community. And instead of maybe being tied to a neighborhood or a city, the community that they're tied to is movement community. And so you just have to think about things in different ways of who is your community and how does your structure work with the way you want to operate.
Yeah, another example of a nationwide one is the Sustainable Economies Legal Law Center, where it's a cooperative of lawyers that basically co-own a practice and they offer their services nationwide. They take on we have a fellow here. She's featured in our cooperative workbook, who is a fellow of the Sustainable Economies Law Center. So there are several that also work on a national or possibly even international business level. Let's see. Yeah, and as Jenny mentioned, 3 is usually a minimum to make governance easier. And this is something that we'll go into a little bit later in the presentation, but we also went into more in depth in our membership and governance that's up on video that's up on our website and will be there in future. But yeah, like it could really start from any number of people. And Heather Cameron Nelson has mentioned that there are also co-ops that help fund the start of other co-ops or programs like Shared Capital Co-op or Seed Commons. Exactly. That is part of what leads to success in projects like in Evergreen. They help to fund, they pull together resources and help to fund new ones. That's generally the model of Mondragon, where it's a big umbrella organization that has different co-ops. And even in difficult times, they can move capital from one place or another. If one co-op is no longer viable as a business, they close that one and then try to find a new place for the employees or start a new co-op based on what is working as profitable at the time. You can, the workbook is, Sophia, the workbook is a free PDF on our website, and we can also talk about printed copies online. Yeah. Let's see. That was a pretty good discussion. Any last questions or observations before we go on to the next part?
Oh, I wanted to just also call out earlier in the chat, Chris saying, just thinking kind of what his the sort of in response to the question, thinking about landscape stewardship, long-term resilience and sharing benefits and responsibilities sound great in the context of landscape stewardship. And Heather Cameron also was like, yeah, it's exciting because it requires a different way of living and taking responsibility, learning new skills for working with people and building the world we want. So I think those are little starburst of kind of ideas coming out of learning about co-ops.
Yeah. And I think housing cooperatives are a particularly exciting example because it's a way, we usually think of home ownership as like a single family home. I think like a housing co-op is something that really works more neighborhood level, and it can work for multifamily buildings. There are examples where tenants have acquired their apartment building and pool what would have been their rent together to gain equity in the building and pay for the regular maintenance that they would normally go through the landlord. Any others that I might have missed? Cool. So next slide. So I'm going to leave this next part to Jenny to start talking about a little bit more in detail about membership and governance.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so we kind of brought these two topics into this introduction to co-ops workshop because they're definitely kind of the building blocks of a co-op. And if you're excited about starting a co-op or getting involved in one, kind of having a better understanding of how these two components play in co-ops will help you, we said, kind of understand how it works in practice. So I can get my computer to cooperate. We're going to talk about membership first. So the question kind of initially you want to think about is who counts as a member to your co-op. So you'll maybe have picked up on this theme so far in our workshop, but there are tons of different kinds of co-ops. There are tons of different options for what a member means. And when we talk about governance, there's also a lot of different ways you can build that. I kind of want to preface this just by saying that what I really love about co-ops is that it really is a fun design process and a really creative way to build something that benefits the people who are involved, because you can sort of piece together these different components and really think about what's going to work best for your group, for your idea. So when it comes to membership, who counts as a member? The answer is it's up to you. And when we talk about members, that can be, like we were talking earlier, worker owners, members, but you're basically collectively deciding on some basic requirements for your membership. And there also might be like different types of members depending on how different people interact with the co-op. So like Switchgrass was a great example of that. They have these different member classes that engage in different ways. And like a grocery store co-op might also have where you could have a consumer like member, a person that's shopping at the store. You could have a worker member who is owning and like working at the store. But depending on the idea, you're going to really craft this. I think that considering what membership means to your co-op is a really important thing to reflect on, because these are also the people that are going to be, you're going to be working really closely with. You're going to be making big decisions together. You're going to be resolving conflict together. You're going to be celebrating successes. So considering how someone joins the co-op, that pathway to membership can be really helpful as kind of pre-work to help set you up for success so that you're able to work together and make decisions together effectively. The other, big reason it's important to define is it just helps kind of build trust. It creates a very clear on-ramp for engagement for people to join. And it kind of just helps set the stage for good governance, which we're going to talk about next. We're really broad here, but does anyone have any quick questions or thoughts about members, what it means?
Are you going to touch on your organization a little bit later? Are you going to touch on your organization to give a little
Oh, on
information
Co-op
how you're
STL?
going to run? Yeah.
Yeah,
Are
actually,
you going to touch on that?
I meant to bring that up in the slide because we're in the process of more formalizing our organization. So we're a pretty informal group of volunteers for the past year, but we're recently having conversations and setting our bylaws and figuring out what are those members, what does it mean to be a member, and also probably how we can have sort of different member classes of like co-ops that are a part of us as like kind of a more of a networking thing, or members who are helping facilitate workshops like this versus members who are just like supporting the work. So we're we're sorting through that right now, which is kind of fun because we're doing what we have been teaching and like helping people do. Cool.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll jump in. I'll talk a little bit about
Thanks.
that, but we are thinking about eventually becoming that worker self-directed nonprofit because we think that there's a lot of benefit to being in that kind of legal structure. But what does that look like as far as like who are members? I think it's going to be an interesting mix of like staff and folks who volunteer their time, but like, yeah, we're still working through exactly what are those membership roles and how do we make sure that the folks who have really given up themselves and who we want to bring into the fold are really like honored in their decision making, and the compensation all really works together as we're designing the membership. So it's a work in progress, but really informed by all of this information.
Yeah, and the particular form that that your cooperative takes, there's a limited, so there's often not the best legal incorporation for a cooperative because they're not as widespread in the United States. There's been some proposed legislation to make it easier to incorporate as a co-op. And the reason why we would go for nonprofit in particular is because grant eligibility often requires a 501c3 or similar, but you may have a time where the legal status of your organization doesn't quite match, and that might be a requirement of a loan, for instance, which is maybe something we could go into a little bit more. But what's
Yeah, and I
important
think
is practicing the principles.
yeah. And I remember when I was first like getting into co-ops and figuring out how to transition the company I work for into a co-op, I was getting really caught up in like, oh, like how do we, like, are we an LLC? Are we this? Are we that? And there's I think taking a step back as if you're at the very beginning of something and really thinking about some of these questions of like visioning what the membership looks like, visioning how your governance can work, because some of those legal details can be worked out with a law clinic at WashU like we used. But making sure that everyone who's involved is sort of like very clear, and that you're also making these decisions through a lens of your like project's values. And sort of filtering, okay, if we're going to say members need to work here a year, when my company first transitioned, we said we're going to have members have to work here 2 years. And after a year, we were like, why did we say 2 years? Like, we just thought we would know for sure that they would be a great owner by 2 years. And we were like, a year is a long time. So we actually amended our operating agreement and changed that. But yeah, part of that was like, no, actually the goal is to get people to become worker owners, and the longer they have to wait, they also might not do it. So yeah, it's just it's a really fun process to think about. The other
Thanks
thing,
for
oh yeah,
sorry, Jenny. Point out. Thanks for the supportive comment from Chris. Another common practice also is with the like probationary members that sometimes, even though technically they're not a member yet, they're still allowed to vote and participate in decision making, depending on how you decide to do it. It's a good way to kind of preview, the benefits and responsibilities of becoming a member too.
yeah. So Membership is that kind of one of the first big things you want to think about. Who are we doing this with? How do they become a member? How do they get to that point where they are controlling and benefiting and owning the co-op? And the sort of thing that those members do together is they govern the co-op. So we also want to consider how our cooperative governance works. And as I said, we will be repeating, there are a bunch of different ways you can do this. Depending on your organization or your business. So it's based on your size, your operation, and what your membership looks like. So we have a couple of components that are, you could potentially use. These are not, you do not have to use all of them, but you might provide some combination of these to help govern your co-op. And so I also just want to point out really quick before we dive in the kind of difference between like operations and governance. So our governance, what we're talking about now, are the people who, own and control the co-op, those members, and how they make decisions about the co-op. And your operations is maybe how you are actually doing your day-to-day work. With some co-ops, those are very separate things, and some they completely overlap. And I think another sort of misnomer about co-ops that people, when you say, oh, let's talk, like we're talking about co-ops, they're like, oh, probably don't get anything done because everybody has to make a decision about every single thing that happens. But that is not always the case. Definitely in a co-op, trying to flatten hierarchy is always kind of a goal, but that's not to say that there aren't structures to put in place to make decision-making easy. And it doesn't mean that when you're deciding, well, should we buy this mechanical pencil or this sharpened, like old school pencil, that everyone has to weigh in on that. But there's structures that you put in place to make that happen. So we're talking about governance. We're talking about those big decisions that all the members get to weigh in on. So the components, we have our members. They're definitely going to be a component of this. You could have a board, so a small group of elected people who make maybe a certain type of decision on their own. Committees, so those could be formed out of members and maybe also voted on, and they might have specific goals, like one could be conflict resolution, one could be like a financial review committee. We also have sociocracy circles, which is just another type of way to form decision making. So it's kind of similar to committees, but it's a very specific mode of decision making where there's overlap in all the circles, so everyone is sort of like linked together, and a great way to kind of have a very involved and consensus decision making process to move things forward. A leadership circle might be kind of similar to a board, but it could have different requirements. Like a leadership circle, maybe you're automatically on it if you've been at the co-op for more than 10 years, or, it might not be something that's voted on, but they're sort of just designated leaders that begin to make maybe different decisions than the membership at large. And then we also have a manager over here in the corner. So they maybe are informing or informed by the decisions that the governance is making, but they might be more on the operations side, but the information from them might be important to those decisions that are going on. So just some quick, speculative examples here. A small co-op, the governance could be structured like this. We were talking about this earlier. A small co-op could be 3 members, and that could be the governance as well. Those 3 members, and they make decisions based on consensus. And so when they're deciding on a budget for next year, or they're deciding whether they should buy that piece of equipment or hire a new person, the 3 of those people get together and they come to consensus around those decisions. So that's a very simple, straightforward way to structure governance for a small co-op. With a medium-sized co-op, so this might be one with like 20, 50, 100 members, this sort of gets a little more complicated. So we have all of our members. We have a board that is elected by the members, and it's made up of members, and they make big decisions. There are committees, and the board can join those committees. The members can join those committees. The committees make proposals to the board, and they might approve those. If there's ever a decision that just seems like too big or outside of what has been outlined for the board to make decisions about, they defer back to the membership. So they say, okay, guys, we have this really big decision. The 5 of us are not allowed to make this on our own. We have a ballot and every member has to vote on this, and that's going to help guide us. So it's a way that every member is still involved by democratically electing the board and maybe the committees as well, but also still having a vote on maybe how they decide to distribute profits at the end of the year, things like that. And all that stuff would be outlined in an operating agreement or your bylaws, how those decisions are made and how the governance works to like flow those decisions through. Some quick examples, local. So this is Garrity Tools. This is where I work. We make pottery tools. We're a small co-op. We have 7 employees and 4 of us are worker owned. Sorry, 5 are work owners now. We just had a person become, so I was like, they were half of one. But this sort of describes how we work, where we have our worker owners, but in order to, we call worker owners members worker owners at Garrity Tools. So we have 5 members, but in order to become a member, you have to work there a year. You have to be voted in by the current membership, and then you have to pay a capital contribution of about $2,000. And you also have to serve a probationary or like a practice period of 2 months. So once you apply to be a member, you sit in on our worker owner meetings that happen once a month. You can like weigh in on what we're talking about, but you don't have a vote. So we can kind of see how you're thinking about decisions. And then once you're voted in, you get voting rights as a member. So it's kind of similar to that first one that we showed, where it's just like the 3 members, except for we just have a slightly bigger staff. Another example that sadly closed, but Marsh was a local grocery co-op, and they had a structure. They were actually a nonprofit organization, so they had a board that kind of made larger governance decisions about the organization at large, but they had these different member classes. So they had producer owners. These are the people that were either providing the produce that was sold or making like value-added products that were sold. They're made in the kitchen and sold in the store. They had worker owners, so the people that were running the grocery store, and then consumer owners, so the people that were shopping at the grocery store. And each of these members had sort of different requirements of how you became a member and then different benefits, but they all were able to weigh in on the operations of the organization. And there was at least one person from each of these membership classes that was on the board. So they had, each membership class had representation on the board. So, and I think our next slide, is a quote from Marsh. So a huge benefit of our cooperative is that everyone who comes in has the ability to co-imagine what the space could be, to ask for what you need, and to have your needs met. That goes for workers, members, and people who shop here. Having a space that prioritizes agency is huge because it's not a given in most spaces. And I think this is a great quote that sort of encompasses the idea that when we're building things like our membership requirements or our governance structures, we want those to reflect the values of the organization, the business, whatever the co-op is. So for Marsh, it was that everyone who is a part of that space gets a say in how it looks, how it operates. And so their structure where all these different components that make up the grocery store, everyone can be a member, and then everyone can also serve as sort of like a governance director on the board was also really important. So thinking about that as we sort of transition to the next part of our workshop, but how I think sometimes the idea of a co-op and building out can feel overwhelming just because the possibilities are infinite, but I would like to shift that thinking a little bit and out of the overwhelm and into the exciting. And in that you can really play around with how to create a totally different like structure and world that we can kind of operate and live in outside of capitalism and consumerism and all those things, but have a new space where your values are really reflected in the way your co-op is structured, which is cool. I'm going to hand it back over to Chris to kind of touch again on some more benefits of cooperatives.
Yeah, so to round us out, kind of go back and summarize, like, what are the reasons that you form a co-op? Why are co-ops, why are we supporting co-ops as an institution that we want to flourish? So some of the benefits for members, who are the primary beneficiaries of a co-op, is autonomy and decision-making authority, something you usually don't have in your job. You usually have your supervisor tell you how to do your job, what your hours are. Whereas with a worker co-op, you are, co-owners of the business. And so you make decisions, both in your interest as a worker and your interest as, your daily operations, and also for the net benefit, the continued existence and prospering of the business, and everything else. They pool resources. So this is especially useful for like producer cooperatives or purchaser or consumer cooperatives. Like producer cooperative might have multiple businesses or individual, business owners or other members that contribute some kind of product to put in a pool. Then, whereas if one producer can't make enough volume to attract certain customers, they can put all of their produce together, and that might create enough volume to make it attractive to a buyer. I think Prairie Farms is an example of a producer cooperative around here, where it's multiple dairy producers that sell under one label to grocery stores. And also consumer cooperatives are a way that, an individual doesn't make any sense for an individual to buy in bulk from wholesale, whereas like a lot of cooperative coming together, can pool those resources, and they can share and then spend a lot less per person on something in particular. And Heather wanted to share, yes, the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, which is another good resource. Is there a membership organization of cooperatives in general in the United States? Chris also has a comment. Hi, Jenny. Is there a name associated with the landscape co-op that you mentioned? So there was a landscaping one.
They do have a name, but I'm blanking on it. I'm gonna have to reach out to the person and ask again.
Yeah, and Heather is also saying that Ocean Spray and Land O'Lakes are organized as co-ops. Electrical, utility co-ops also exist, where the members are, the ratepayers, that much like a credit union where depositors are members. And really, it all depends on, how it comports to values, and how, ideally, members have autonomy and input into the decision making. But yeah, other benefits for members of cooperatives is worker power and control when we're talking about worker cooperatives or worker self-directed nonprofits. Usually not something that you're able to do in a traditional business. Also the decisions are informed by practice. So you don't have someone who's not doing your job telling you how to do your job. It also benefits from everyone that does every different kind of job, ideally in a worker cooperative or whatever cooperative you're organizing under. They can bring their different experiences and their different sides of the operation and be able to discuss openly how to make these work better together, whereas a lot of these decisions would otherwise be made top down. And cooperatives have a number of benefits for the community. I've got another comment from Cameron. Gardening and laundry companies are often easiest to turn to cooperatives. That is what Evergreen did, for example. Lower capital investment, good profit margins can raise benefits and quality of the job for worker owners, definitely. What Evergreen did with starting the laundry, it's often called the anchor institution model, where their partnership taking on the contracts for the Cleveland Clinic gave them a large customer that's reliable, helps them build a base from that. So those are good strategies on a community level for how to build out cooperatives. But also for the community, it extends democratic control of resources. You're not just trying to attract X company with a tax break to invest into a community. You're actually, you're more likely, if you're practicing the principles, to involve members of the community in these decisions. Some community trusts may operate on this model where they either have some public funds or they have some kind of savings between members of the community, and they decide how to invest it with the benefit of everyone in mind. And there's all kinds of investments that could be good for some people and bad for others. Like if you're buying up real estate and raising the price, for instance. If you're a cooperative that is practicing the principle about concern for community, you're gonna make sure that your investments have a positive impact. They're not taking away from the community. And that which ultimately benefits the cooperative. If they're working together sufficiently, then you are more effectively moving resources between and building the kind of resilience that tends to happen if a region has a well-organized network of cooperatives. And relatedly, they're non-extractive, so you don't have a multinational corporation setting up a store in a community, and whereas the profits are leaving the community, they're going to pay the shareholders. I guess one good example of how it went wrong was believe a lot of the shop-in saves in North County in St. Louis. Because at least some of them received tax breaks, and at one point, all of them closed because their parent company decided to get out of the retail business of the grocery operation. And so, basically all of these had to be sold to another buyer who was interested in operating them. A lot of them didn't find a buyer, and so all of a sudden, a lot of them closed, leaving a lot of people out of jobs. Now, if the people who were working there were owning it, they wouldn't have a good reason to do that. They would, maybe even take some temporary sacrifices to make sure that the company continues to exist, so that it doesn't just get the investment pulled. And usually the thing that makes the most, at least short-term sense for any investment is that once the economy turns sour, you pull the investment and put it somewhere it's going to receive higher returns. Whereas if you're actually practicing the community, you have a lot of reasons not to want to do that, especially if you live in the community that you're working in. So this is a model that can be non-extractive compared to the way that usually, especially if it's an arms race between different cities or states or municipalities, each offering bigger tax breaks for the other. Instead, you're trying to build your economic development capacity from within, and the resources and people that already exist there. And it has resilience from crisis. There's many examples of cooperatives actually doing better than peer organizations. Even when I mentioned the law in Italy, which was called the Morcora law, which allowed people to get their unemployment benefits in a lump sum to create cooperatives. I mean, you would think that these would have, be really risky because in some way, like they're being laid off, the business is closing, prior to it being converted into cooperative. But, you have a great natural experiment comparing different business together, and they had at least as good survival rate as peer businesses. So they're proven to be, like any business, they can fail, but they're proven to work at least as well as traditional businesses and often better. Like I mentioned earlier about Evergreen, they were still growing when the economy took the downturn in 2020. And, a lot of these regions that have a good network of cooperatives that are working well together, they tend to have a better experience when suddenly the market starts to go down. So next slide. So I'd like to take some time to share your thoughts on what you've learned, what you'd like to know about. This would be really helpful for future workshops in particular, if we want to know what particular topics that we broached today that we'd like to go into more detail that can help to inform the workshops we put in the future. Also, just generally any comments or questions that that have come to mind, and you can either come off mute or type in the chat, and we can engage with what people are thinking about.
Are there other pitfalls that people thinking about starting them should be mindful of, aside from the, you know, sorry, I have a cold, a little bit of a cold. The year of kind of like the probation, or the example you just used where you try to minimize outside, you know, income, or outside investments, I should say, tanking your, you know, your situation because they don't have as much of a vested interest. Are there other things that people should be mindful of that have been known to kind of get in the way of what the cooperative's mission is, and tank it?
Yeah, I mean, this is where like defining your membership and defining, how a person enters and leaves is really important. When we go into, in decision making, a lot of that is how to manage interpersonal conflict. It's probably like much like businesses, especially if they have multiple owners, the biggest reason why things would turn bad is because there are interpersonal conflicts that aren't being worked out. So it's really important to be intentional, try to anticipate any problems, especially between people. How do you work out disagreements? How do you settle things in a way that is beneficial to everybody? So that's a common thing, in terms of the probationary period, and those are all things that you want to try to set, and you might change them over time depending on your experience. But, it might be changing what's the probationary period, what is the capital contribution you're going to require, like how much, is it going to be different depending on people's income, depending on the cooperative.
Yeah, I would say too, to reinforce that, like one of the things that we didn't think about when we transitioned the company to a co-op, to Garrity Tools to a co-op. I think we're all very excited about the sort of benefits and power of transitioning to a co-op in terms of giving everyone the opportunity to own the company. But to Chris's point, like understanding, I think with a co-op, I always say it's a depending on the structure for us, it was a company that's now operating on like a very human scale. So like it's running a business, but with employees at the forefront, which is not like something, if you've worked anywhere potentially, that like your brain has been trained in America. And so doing some pre-work around like getting everyone on the same page about conflict resolution, about how to facilitate meetings, about how to read financial statements, about, preparing everyone to have a clear understanding of all those, not only operations of the company, but operations of how we should be working in relation to each other, can be really important. So whether that's like for us when we started, even we did sort of like almost like a book club, but we were reading different articles and books about co-ops, about those things that principle of like education and training that goes with co-ops is a really good thing to invest in upfront, I think. And maybe not even I want to say invest, I don't mean money, just time.
I think one more pitfall that some co-ops come up against is founder syndrome. I think especially like we create cooperatives around the things that we really love. And so when you try and move maybe beyond the first few people who created it, or you might get like a little precious about the thing that you created. And so it's again, it's like learning those practices of like we're in this together, and being ready to move through conflict together. I think like there probably will be conflict regardless of like everything you attempt. But like if you're ready to move through conflict and like be willing to listen to each other and create something, you can kind of move beyond that founder syndrome as long as kind of you're working from the same value set.
Yeah, so in addition to, defining how someone becomes a member, also keep in advance how someone exits, because not everyone's going to want to be there the whole time. Maybe they wanted to move on to something else. And so dealing with in advance, like how are you going to, or how are they going to sell their assets back to the cooperative? How are new people going to make their contribution to purchasing and holding those assets and things like that?
And that was something we had to like move through at Garrity Tools as well to explain to people. It feels like it took a while for our first employees to apply to be worker owners. I think because they were like, ownership, that sounds like a lot of responsibility. And like, then I'm like in this forever, which is not how our business is set up. But we're like, oh, we need to do more education about really like what it means to be a worker owner here. Because you can leave just like you can leave a job and there's a very clear path to like, paying out your capital account and all that. But yeah, you sort of like just the education around shifting how we think about ownership, about how we think about, like running a business together.
And Key had a question about, can you think of other ways this model has been or could be beneficial to nonprofits? Ideally, nonprofits already have strong stated values and mission. As you mentioned, there are no profits to share. So I think one thing, ideally, if let's say you're creating a worker self-directed nonprofit, you're thinking about, avoiding, the problems of founder syndrome, for instance, like because you're having more of the organization take responsibility for decision making. And so, ideally, like if you get into the practice of that, people are already doing the work of cooperating, figuring out how to make compromises when they need to, how to make decisions. And even though like sometimes the nonprofit term can be a little bit misleading because nonprofits can have profits. The only legal requirement is that they can't distribute the profits to owners. So they may have a surplus and they might take in more revenue than they spend in the year. And, often that gets invested somewhere else. In fact, there's some very wealthy nonprofits that have all kinds of investments that they use this for. But that's another thing that you would want to that could benefit is that if you do have a surplus in a nonprofit, you have more people involved in deciding where that gets invested. And possibly, if people live in the community and they have an interest in having it flourish and not leaving people behind, they might object to certain kinds of investments that actually would do harm to the community. And you're probably more likely going to be sensitive to that when more people are involved in those decisions, particularly if they're at all levels of the organization.
Another
I also
way,
think,
oh, go ahead, Zandi.
yeah, I think like a lot of the nonprofits that would be interested in a kind of a worker self-directed nonprofit model probably already operate in ways that are reflective of what the model could be. I think like if you're interested in this, you probably try and share decision making amongst all your employees and allow the people who are working on something to be the ones to make decisions about it and to really be open. And I think the benefit to moving really intentionally towards a worker self-directed structure is you clarify those roles, and you might earth some things, some dynamics and some power, like power dynamics or some voices that are not being heard in a way that's really intentional so that you can even more strongly live your values by being really clear about how you are operating together.
I think too, like I was looking back at, our earlier slide of like the definition of like the benefit of a co-op, right? So that's like what the members are sharing, but it's the outcome a cooperative is designed to produce for its members. And so it's not, it doesn't have to be money. But like the outcome that I feel like I see in the few like worker self-directed nonprofits that I know of is that I think a common thing in the nonprofit space is just like burnout. And I feel like the benefit that I see in the worker self-directed ones are that they are all working together to really like hold each other accountable and create a work environment that is manageable and like sustainable. And I feel like that is one of the benefits of having everyone like equally a member of those decisions because you're getting like new ideas. You're also helping like know, like, I don't know, I'm gonna say like be more in each other's business to make sure that things are more equally distributed, that everyone is like, yeah, doing an okay amount. So yeah, that would be one thing that I've kind of noticed from those organizations that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, every cooperative works as well as it practices, right? So that's, adherent, faithfulness to the principles, faithfulness to each other. If the organization drifts and there's more inequality in pay or decision making, those are all things that you want to think about in advance and work out, because what the actual result is based on, how you decided to work together.
We've been moving through a lot of these great comments and questions, and I think we have time for one more if there's anything else folks want to put in the chat or pop off mute to share.
Nobody jumps in, then I'll hog the last spot. So you talked about the education piece, and I really like that notion of a book club, because that, that's a really not safe space, but it's more community based and not so much education at people. Everybody's kind of learning together. How did you do the continuous part, like to combat founder syndrome that you mentioned, or trying to get your mind into, oh, I'm an owner, I'm a part owner, and I have to think in a different way that you referred to earlier? How did you actually deliver that education? How did it happen? Did I make sense with my question?
Yeah, I think so. I think Jenny, yeah, but like how did like when you were like convincing people to become member owners when they were initially reluctant to, and taking on more skills and responsibilities?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
like when you
sorry.
said
The audio on
education,
my computer
you
got really quiet and I did miss the beginning of your question. Was it directed to me? Sorry.
well, yeah, you had mentioned that education was a problem, that you realized you had to do more education. And I just wondered what that model of educating others looked like. You had talked about a book club before, which I really like, but then what was that next phase? What was that model?
Yeah. So we at Garrity Tools, because we're still a pretty small group, and up until November of last year, there were just 3 worker owners when we had 7 employees. And we had 2 very recently join that. But one of the things that we've been that's been really awesome is that when I started working there full time, I started working there full time because we were going to transition the company to becoming a co-op. So that was part of my job there. And we had the resources that we wanted to dedicate to that. And as the business has grown, we just time-wise and my other responsibilities, I haven't had as much time to dedicate to sort of the co-op education side of things, but that has been in my job description since the beginning. And this year we are actually hiring someone else, and I will be able to focus on that again. But one thing is that there's someone that works at our co-op that's like part of one of their job responsibilities is co-op education and staying connected to the co-op larger community. And then for me, being able to do this work with Co-op STL is a great way that I get to be out in the community, but also it benefits me at work. And, I can send these workshop links to the folks that I work with and share the workbook with them. But it's something that we're still kind of developing. So we don't have a specific set of things that we do or a path, but especially as our new worker owners came on, we're already building out a better kind of guidebook for them in terms of training as they become a worker owner. But in creating that, I'm like, oh, we need to make this for when you start as an employee, that kind of helps train you onto the on-ramp for ownership. So it's just a constant imagining of those things. And I think maybe I was thinking this earlier to someone else's question, but one of the other things that I always like to encourage people to remember is that creating these initial ideas and rules for membership and your operating agreement and your governance, part of your co-op, what should be built in it is just constantly evaluating those things and updating them for what's actually going on. So we do that with our education too. That was a long-winded answer. I hope that touched on something.
And I think also, if you move to the next slide, another way you can think about working through things is our workbook, which is posted online, and it has a lot of activities that you can learn something together by looking at the workbook, and then do the activities together and really co-imagine. And that is one resource among many. If you go to the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, or if you're interested in worker self-directed nonprofits, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, all these resources out there, if you just pick one and work through it together, that can be a way to kind of work through things, and you can keep building new resources on as you want to learn new skills together. So yes, please check out our work book, and we are right at time. So I'm going to throw in the chat a link to our evaluation and to our next workshop. So that's going to be our next workshop, which is Co-op Talks. It's going to be on membership and governance, which is, if you go on our website, we have a recording that we did a couple of years ago. So we would ask that you watch through that online recording, get a sense for what we talked about, so that if you come to this workshop on February 18th, you have that background, you can come ready to engage, ask your questions, get deep with us on that topic. I also put the evaluation in the chat, and we would really love if you fill that out and let us know how we did, so we can continue to improve these offerings for folks. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate you spending this hour and a half with us.